Okay, continuing on in section 10.5 and 10.6, we're looking at absolute value inequalities. So, much like we have two solutions sometimes with an absolute value equation, we are going to have two inequalities from each absolute value inequality. So, first, let's talk about what solutions would actually work. So let's look at example 1. I like to know kind of what I could plug in there that would be true. Some of the solutions that I could plug in, could I plug in 0? Yes, it looks like the absolute value of 0, that's going to be less than 2.5. Ask yourself, could I plug in 1? And I could plug in 1. Okay, could I plug in 5? Let me go to the eraser. And could I plug in 5? No, because the absolute value of 5 is 5, and that is not true. Okay, could I plug in, let's say, a negative 2? And I think I could plug in a negative 2 because the absolute value of negative 2 is just 2. So these are just some of the solutions that I get. Now let's talk about the two inequalities that you would write. You need to isolate, like we've been talking about, isolate this absolute value. Okay, so is the absolute value by itself? In example 1, yes. Then what we're going to do is our first inequality, we're going to translate just like it looks. We're going to say x is less than 2.5. Really, the only thing I did to write that is I just took off the absolute value. Now, notice that this is less than. This is really important. Less than, I want you to think of as and, okay? So in class, I'll always say less than, think and. So emphasize less than and think of that as and. So what we're going to do is we're going to write this as a conjunction. So x is going to be less than 2.5, and now we're going to do x is going to be greater than a negative 2.5. So these are the two inequalities that will always be true, and you'll see the pattern that we continue to look at. So let's graph that really quickly to see if it matches our solutions. So we've got here's 0, we'll say here's 2.5, and here's negative 2.5. So if I were to graph, I'm just going to erase this so it's out of the way. If I were to graph example 1, so my first inequality right here, I would have an open circle at 2.5, and then I would go to shade things like 0, negative 2, positive 1. All right, then I'm going to look at my second inequality that I wrote, and I would put an open circle at 2.5, and then I would shade things like 0, 1, positive 2, and so on. Now, since this is an and, less than is and, we are looking for the overlap right here. So we could actually write this as one combined inequality, and we always start with that smallest number. Negative 2.5 is less than x is less than 2.5. So what I want you to remember is less than is and really emphasize that less than is and, okay? Now, when we look at example 2, you're going to see that the absolute value is isolated already. So now we're going to split it apart. Now notice when I write this inequality, I'm going to get y is greater than 1.5. Notice I said greater because greater is going to be or. So the only difference here when we split this up is you're going to say y is greater than or equal to 1.5, or y is going to be less than or equal to a negative 1.5. And then if we were to graph, remember this is a disjunction because it's an or, we're going to have 0. I'm just going to put this as 1.5, and this is a negative 1.5. When I graph this first inequality, I'm going to put a closed dot at 1.5, and I'm going to shade things like 5, 10, 15. And then for my second inequality, I'm going to put a closed dot also, but notice I'm going less than. So I'm shading things like negative 5, negative 10, negative 15. So these are all of my solutions. So since it's an OR graph, I include everything. So I have lots of different solutions because I just need a solution that works in one or the other. And remember, anything that you've shaded, you should be able to plug in, like the absolute value of 10. That's going to be greater than 1.5. The absolute value of a negative 10, that's going to be greater than 1.5. So what you need to remember here is greater, and I'm emphasizing greater, you're going to think or. So in class I always say less than is and, greater is or, to help you remember.